Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sinead Leahy, and I'm from the New Zealand Greenhouse Gas Research Centre here in Palmerston North. It's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you all to the very first webinar in our Towards a Low Emissions Future webinar series, which is being run by the Centre here in partnership with the Ministry of Primary Industries. This webinar series has really come about because, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we were unable to have our April conference. And as an alternative, we decided to put together this 6-week seminar series. It's going to be happening every Tuesday morning. And if you haven't already, I really recommend that you go and check out some of those downstream webinars that are going to be happening. We've got some fantastic speakers and presentations coming your way. So on behalf of the organising team, we hope you find this webinar series useful and informative. And with that, I'm now going to hand you over to the chair, Dr. John Roche, the Chief Scientific Officer at the Ministry of Primary Industries. John, over to you.
Hello, Sinead. Thank you. And Morena, everyone. Look, it's my privilege to chair the first of these webinar series in this new world post-COVID, but now at level 1, at least, you know, things returning to a degree of normality here in Aotearoa. Like it's following on from 2 Irish accents. It's my privilege, although he doesn't have an Irish accent. I suppose you can take the person out of Ireland, but you can't take the Irish genetics out of the person. And it's my privilege to introduce the Honourable Damien O'Connor, who is going to launch our webinar, setting the direction for climate change. So Minister O'Connor is a person that believes that every New Zealander, regardless of their background or family situation, deserves the opportunity to realise their full potential and participate in their community and society. The Minister stands for values of equality and opportunity. So as many of you will know, Minister has a background in farming and adventure tourism, and that drives his view that we need well-paid sustainable jobs and industry growth in rural New Zealand to improve our future, and probably even more so in the current environment that we find ourselves in and that the world finds itself in. He's a passionate advocate for rural communities and for a thriving agricultural sector, and I can say that with the utmost sincerity, having had my own role for the last couple of years. The Minister was elected to Parliament in 1993 and has served as a Minister in both the 5th and 6th Labour governments, and has been a spokesperson for a variety of roles, including agriculture, biosecurity, food safety, tourism, immigration and health. Minister is an active sportsman and represented Buller at athletics. He has won West Coast Young Farmer of the Year and enjoys sports including skiing, whitewater rafting, jet boating, motorsports, and playing rugby for the New Zealand parliamentary team. So without further ado, my pleasure to invite Minister Honourable Damien O'Connor, the Minister for Agriculture, to open this webinar. Thank you, Minister.
Kia ora, and thank you, John, and that probably doesn't leave me too much time after all of that. But look, welcome to a webinar series, and I think we are all now used to, I guess, working online. Having to look at your own face on the screen is a bit odd, I have to say, but it's the way of the world, and I guess we've learned much from COVID, and I guess trusting, technology to be able to communicate and learn is one of those things. Look, can I just acknowledge the NZ Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, and can I MPI as well. A lot of good work going on, and I'd just like to thank you for, I guess, the research and the advice and the progress that we're making through both organisations. Look, I've been asked about setting directions, and if I can go back to, it's actually 1997 when the Honourable Simon Upton negotiated for New Zealand, and it was Kyoto Protocol, and he effectively said that if New Zealand was to be part of an international commitment to climate change and reduction of emissions, then agriculture had to be part of it. And I think at that time there was an ambition that because of our forest plantings, we were going to be ahead of the game. And the reality, of course, when we came into government in the early 2000s, we had a look at these things. It wasn't quite that simple. We had proposed a carbon tax as a way forward of committing to that and managing our obligations. That was rejected by farmers in particular. An ETS was set up, and the following government, of course, endorsed that. So we had an ETS, an obligation to include agriculture, and a challenge that we hadn't worked out how to do it. And so we have been working through that over the last 2.5 years and got to the point now where E Waka e Noa is an agreement between the agricultural sector and government to take the next 5 years to work out how to best include agriculture in our emissions reduction objectives, and be accurate in our measurement, work on the particular unique aspects of New Zealand agriculture and how we might best meet those challenges. There is a lot, as there always has been, a lot of research going on in New Zealand. I'd like to think that our farming systems have always been based on science, and they're always backed by science, I know. We always push the boundaries. We are innovative, and we think we will, we can solve many of the problems with a piece of number 8 wire. But then we follow through with research to back that up, and I'm sure this will be one more of those challenges that we will face up to, and I'm sure we will be able to get through. I guess disruption, be it through economic, and the global financial crisis was one of those economic disruptions, and chaos, well, perhaps not chaos if we can work on it. Climate change disruption through adverse events, which we see an increasing number of them, means that we are going to have to be innovative and adaptive in our farming system going forward. And I think that what we're putting up by way of climate change challenge is something that we will be able to adapt to. We're moving into a post-COVID environment that does offer opportunities for us. What we've seen is a focus on food, on the basics of life, I guess, across the world, and different ways of approaching it in different countries. But the dependence on food and its reliable supply, I think has had its profile raised. And as the suppliers of that food, be it to Singapore and traditional trading nations, and China in particular, we're in a lucky position that we've been able to continue to do that, produce. We've kept the doors open for access, and indeed, I believe there'll be increasing demand over time. While at the moment some of the markets have been disrupted, we've seen with meat, a quick shift in focus. Dairy, we've seen fairly steady demand. Horticulture has been going really well. So that position that we are in as the producers of food, I think, offers a huge advantage. But we do have this long-standing commitment to honour our international objectives of trying to reduce emissions across the world. And whether it's a KPMG report, or whether it's the Primary Sector Council's Fit for a Better Future report, whether it's the recently released Farm to Fork EU strategy, they all point to the urgent need to address the climate change and emission issues around livestock production in particular, but across agriculture. And it's not simple. So we have some legislation in place working through the adjustments to the ETS to try and provide the right financial incentives to make sure that the ETS does give us the right outcomes, not perverse outcomes. And we hope to get that in a good space actually before the election, so that the ETS legislation and the system is going to work to help us in our direction. But we've got, I don't want to go into the science. There'll be people who are a lot wiser who will speak about the science and the potential adaptation and adjustment that we are working through in New Zealand and sharing with the rest of the world. I was the only politician, I have to be very proud of it, to speak in Berlin at the GRA conference there. And I think that was not because of me, but because of New Zealand's position that we've committed to support the GRA. It is a virtual international network, which is great. We don't have a big institution, but we have a network of scientists working to share their knowledge and information. And I think that's outstanding. And we will come up with new ideas. I guess one of the ones that we're investigating and supporting is the one of Sphaerogopsis as a red seaweed. And the claims that it could reduce methane emissions from livestock up to 80% almost seem unbelievable. But, you know, I read 2, 3, 4 times, you know, the advice to myself before I would state it in public. But clearly, even if we got to half of that, if we were able to, I guess, deliver that to animals in a consistent way and get that kind of methane reduction, that's incredible. That's an opportunity. And I know other countries are looking at seaweed as a possible mitigation, I guess, pathway. So look, I won't say too much more than that. We've got, I guess, the measurement of on-farm emissions is a challenge. Soil emissions, soil carbon is something that I really would love to see more work done on, and there's great debate around that. We don't know enough about the soil to know whether we can accumulate more carbon in the soil. You can in older soils that might be depleted of carbon. Can we do that in relatively new soils that we have in New Zealand? I think we probably can. So that the money for Overseer in last year's budget, the 40 million or thereabouts, to I guess validate, to update, and to make more useful the Overseer model is something that we've, you know, that money is being spent wisely to try and make it more useful when it comes to measurement of on-farm emissions. Look, we have got through $100 million provincial growth fund, we've got $10 million, of course, for riparian planting. We've got over $1 billion for environmental programs that include land management, agriculture, and the rest. So there's plenty of support for us to do the right thing. I guess working out, you know, what are the options, what's the best science to support that, and you know, how we can encourage farmers. I'll finish with, you know, one statement is that the farmers have to really understand the why for all this. And it is very easy to work on a farm, and the climate changes, the weather changes every day. And so it can be a bit confusing if people say it's warming when, you know, you've had a really cold season. And so farmers sometimes struggle to understand the why. There's a bit of confusing information internationally about climate change out there, or they pick up the wrong stuff. But actually, if they have a look at some of the international reports around glaciers receding and overall the temperature of the sea or whatever, then the science is irrefutable, and we should be committed to do everything we can as a country that has always prided itself on environmental initiatives and our management. So we therefore have to be at the forefront of including agriculture in our emissions reduction objective. And coming up with techniques and with science that can help the rest of the world. So that's how I see the direction of travel, and the government's committed to help the sectors, and we want to help science to help the sectors. So I'm happy now to take some questions, and I just wish everyone who's come onto the seminar all the best. It's time that you've committed to this cause. You may be wanting to hear some answers, you may be a bit sceptical, but hopefully through the webinar series, you know, you'll be a lot wiser, and hopefully just as committed to climate change and emissions reduction as the rest of us are. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Minister. There's a couple of questions that have come through that are technical questions, so I won't put those ones to you. I'm sure Kate and Sinead will be able to we'll be able to answer those afterwards. But look, you talked there about, you know, us leading the world, and certainly, you know, the government, and through your leadership with He Waka Eke Noa, you know, the rest of the world is watching the partnership that we have formed with industry. You know, do you think that there is going to be a bigger market for our products if we manage to crack this, Minister, if we manage to get our greenhouse gases down from our food and fibres?
Absolutely, I do, and I think we've been doing some in-market research in terms of organic production, and then what is deemed regenerative production, and then still the jury's out on what that is exactly. But in the US, what they call regenerative attracts huge premiums in the market on the basis that people want to buy products that they feel may be contributing positively to our world and our planet. And so the values that drive consumer production, I think the things we have to connect to. And in a general sense, our pastoral systems are close to what they would call regenerative in the US. Now, that's slightly different in the EU or the UK and maybe China. So we're, in terms of the Primary Sector Council's report, Fit for a Better Future, they have referred to the need for us to establish what is regenerative, and we're working through legislation on organic, and then if regenerative can help connect to the values of our consumers, and we can deliver on that in a credible way, then I think there's a huge potential for us to be supplying the most discerning customers who want a better world, who need food and fibre, and want to source it from a place of credibility, of integrity, and of systems that are the best in the world. And so that's what we are seeking to do to shift us into that space.
Kia, yeah, thanks, Minister. There's a number of points been raised about overseer and having soil built into overseer, soil carbon built into overseer. And I know you've been a strong champion of overseer and the utilization of overseer to achieve our goals. Have you any comment on that?
Look, overseer is the best model. It's not perfect. There would be many people who could criticise it for a whole lot of reasons. I think one, say, being lucerne, plantain. Both of those plants in a farming system are not accounted for properly in the overseer model. But we've got international peer review of it. We're seeking the best international advice on what we should do to improve it. And the alternative is, of course, an input-based system, and that gets really messy. Although we have in the latest water reforms put on a cap of 190 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, we believe that that's just to take the very top of those high end users. But the rest of it, we would much rather have an output-based model. Overseer is the best one. It can account for emissions at this point. We just have to refine it so that it's user friendly and it's trusted.
No, look, I think you're right, Minister. I think the approach we've taken, which is to limit output rather than legislate on inputs, it drives innovation, as you've suggested, and that I think you've answered a couple of the questions that have come through in that point. Just to go back to one point that you raised in your discussion about farmers needing to understand the why. From a scientist perspective, we're possibly not always the best at communicating that with farmers. Have you got any advice for our science audience on that?
Look, no, possibly not the best. Look, I think we've got some really pragmatic scientists in our country. We're lucky. But pulling the best of that science internationally into a digestible form for New Zealand farmers, so that we're not just using our own science, and the GRA is a platform for the best international knowledge. I think given a challenge, farmers love to take that up and follow that through, and they love to, I guess, in my experience as a farmer, in discussion groups with Dairy NZ advisors or so-called advisors. Good, robust debate is the best way to work through what are local solutions for what it may be national standards or national guidelines. We have many soil types. We've got a new country from a geological perspective, and so we've got to be prepared to accept the wisdom and experience from the farmers on the ground, and mould that with the best science that we can deliver. Look, keep talking, in the paddock is my experience. I think talking in Wellington at conferences doesn't always work, but if we can get that science out into a form that can be talked about at field days or discussion groups, then I think we'll get that knowledge transfer very, very quickly.
Oh, thank you, Minister. Look, I know you're busy. I've got one more question here that's come through, and it's about breeding. Breeding low emitting stock, and we've done some good work on that in New Zealand, some world-leading work. But this question actually relates to the government's appetite for potentially for genome editing in our livestock. If that were to be a fast track towards a reduction in leaching, nitrous oxide, or methane emissions, is that something that you believe your colleagues in government would consider?
Look, we've said that we need to have a mature discussion around it. I mean, GM and I guess CRISPR, the other technologies that have emerged, are the reality of the world that we work in and market to. The question of what we're trying to do here. So we're very good at producing stuff, and we'll continue to be good at producing stuff. We're not so good at marketing and connecting to our customers. And where that does occur in horticulture, where you've got products like gold kiwi fruit, where Zespri, the company, goes in market directly into the supermarkets, talks to their customers, and tells them what they should be buying, we have amazing success. If you step back from that, and we may be able to produce, if we were to use GMO, lower emissions milk, is what's the relative value of that compared to our pasture-based non-GMO milk in the market for the people who are buying our products. And I don't think we've been very good at doing that market analysis alongside, I guess, the technical analysis that we should have. We need to have the discussion, but we have to weigh up what we want to do. And I guess that the Primary Sector Council's task was to say, like, let's have a vision for agriculture. They've not excluded GMO. I think they've said that we need to have that discussion. It's one of a number of tools to help us develop products that consumers want in an enduring and sustainable way. So that enduring and sustainable is not just the production, it's actually the demand for them. And so where that leaves GMO is something, it's a challenging question, not one I can answer, other than to say that government should facilitate a mature discussion. And we're prepared to do that, but it's not just about, and it might be hard for me to convince my colleagues that we should have GMO so we can produce more grass. Whereas in fact what we're doing is producing protein, producing fibre for discerning customers. And does that affect that value chain and ultimately the value at the end of it? That's the things that we need to know more about.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister. Look, your answers to questions, I've got a flood of other questions coming in, but I'm out of time, and we'll have to try and answer.
I'll take one more.
Well, you'll take one more. Let me just see. So there's a question actually here on the potential for seaweed. I agree completely, and it sounds great if it can come to fruition, but it'll need a lot of work, when you consider some of the downsides or the potential downsides of it as well. Does that mean, the government might be willing to delay bringing ag fully into the ETS to allow that research to be undertaken?
Well, the research is being undertaken now. Why would we delay? We've got 5 years now. We're looking at all the tools available. And the fact that we bring it in, at only 5% obligation means that there's a huge concession. The value of us being in an emissions trading scheme or having agriculture in, I think, is also huge. That is, in negotiating a trade agreement with the EU and with the UK, both of those places very proud of their efforts around climate change and emissions reduction. If we can say we've included agriculture, that gives us momentum when it comes to negotiating that market agreement. And so don't underestimate the positives of this. While there may be some adjustments that are needed, I think we can innovate our way through that. But the positives are what we are looking at by inclusion of agriculture in the ETS.
Fantastic. Look, thank you, Minister. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and the positivity that you espouse about all of these issues. Thank you again for your time.
We've got an amazing future as food producers in the world, a world that needs quality, safe food. So we should be excited.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister. That's a great point to leave that discussion. Thank you. So the Minister might stay with us for another few minutes just to hear what's being said, but he's obviously got a busy agenda. So I'm moving on to presenter 2, who is Jenny Marx, one of my colleagues at MPI that I just met this morning virtually. So Jenny has just recently joined MPI as a policy manager. She leads the climate change system team. She's an experienced policy advisor and manager with specialist expertise in the environment and has worked in a number of central and local government agencies for 15 years. So Jenny knows the natural resource sector well and understands how important it is in economic development here in New Zealand, and believes that nature is at the heart of New Zealand's success. So following on very much from the messages that the Minister was giving, I'll hand it over to you, Jenny.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, John. I'm just going to share my screen because I've put together a presentation for this webinar that kind of gives a general overview of the way MPI is working to support the agricultural sector in its transition to a low environmental impact future. So just bear with me as I put the presentation on. Oh, sorry, I'm a little bit of a, it feels like we should be better at this now, but I'm nearly there. Can someone give me a verbal something saying that this works?
Yeah, it works perfect.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you for that. So I was asked to put together something that summarizes how we support farmers here from MPI's perspective. So as you know, that MPI's role as a central government agency is to provide regulation stewardship for primary industries and work with the sector. Our general focus is biosecurity, food safety, forestry, fisheries management, and animal welfare. In our leadership, in our recent strategy, we define our vision as New Zealand wanting to be the most sustainable provider of high-value foods and primary product. So really, our environmental impact is at the heart of what we need to achieve. We do this through working with central and local government, Māori industry bodies, universities, Crown Research Institutes, prime producers, etc., all to help this transition. In our strategy, one key goal is sustainability, and that is because, of course, we know, like you, that future generations will benefit from improved environmental performance. Our goal also reflects the government priorities around its efforts to transition New Zealand to a sustainable and low emissions future. The way we use our land and improving the way we do that can have significant benefits for the health of our waterways, meeting our climate change goals, and increasing productivity of our land. And a key part of achieving that for us is to support farmers and growers to adopt more sustainable land use practices. We're not the only ones, and I think the Minister has outlined it very well before. We want to use our land sustainably, but so do the people that buy our products. So as a key export nation, we're seeing that there's a definite shift in demand for products that pride themselves in high environmental performance, good practice all around, and a lower emissions profile. And we see it as a key part of our work to creating mechanisms that help incentivize and recognize good environmental practice so that we can improve the outcomes and lead the world in this. We also know we're quite special. We are blessed with our climate and soils and general water availability compared to many countries, and we've got incredible geographic and topographic diversity that enables us to have a number of production systems in place, whether that's sheep and beef, avocados, grapes, or whatever. And so that gives us quite a few options. There's also a flexibility in land use through not having a highly regulated and subsidized production system. People can actually make choices around how they want to use land and how they would like to adapt to meet market demand. However, we are also experiencing real pressures on our freshwater resource, and much of our unique native biodiversity is limited to some of our remnant ecosystems. And while we produce some of the most emissions efficient animal product in the world, there are a huge element of our national profile emissions. This will be familiar to you. Agriculture makes up almost half of our emissions profile, and they've increased since we've signed up to Kyoto. And part of it is, part of this pattern is because a lot of our renewable electricity is fairly low in its carbon emissions, so that kind of blows it out. Nevertheless, changing that balance and addressing our emissions profile, including agriculture, is a really important part of our response to climate change as a country. So this government has been really ambitious in making sure that it's working to support this increase in sustainability that underpins the profitability of our primary industries. Just, was it last week, we announced the fresh water reform, the Action for Healthy Waterways. We are, before committee, we've got the Climate Change Response ETR Amendment Bill, which helps legislate some key milestones for a joint action plan with Māori and industry. This is the He Waka i Kanoa that the Minister has talked about. We are supporting the development of a national policy statement for the protection of Indigenous biodiversity as well as part of the wider government effort. And key budget rounds last year and this year are set to support the wider sector to transition. For us, the key one here is a sustainable land use package, which promotes farm land use practices to deliver more value and improve environmental outcomes. And just recently, Budget 2020, or as we sometimes call it, the COVID budget, where primary industries or the primary sector is a key part of that as well. So talking a little bit more about how we see He Waka i Kanoa, it's a key commitment from government to work in partnership with Māori in the food and fibre sector to design a practical and cost-effective system for reducing emissions at the farm level by 2025. The aim is to equip farmers and growers with the knowledge, tool and support that they need to reduce emissions and adapt to this changing climate. That's no mean feat, because we know that from a recent survey of farmers, that while most of them do believe in human contribution to climate change, many of them have not yet taken action to make their farms more environmentally sustainable from a climate change perspective. So many of them have done things to make it more sustainable in general, but don't know much about their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, I see, there's the graph, sorry guys. And so He Waka i Kanoa is working towards all farmers knowing their farm emissions by 2022, piloting an emissions reporting and benchmarking system by 2024, and then finally the system for farm level accounting and reporting of their emissions in place by 2025. There is an agreed plan of action which involves the tools and the benchmarking required to do this, integrated farm planning that includes a real climate module to put into action alongside all the other measures that farmers might undertake on their farm, increasing the advisory capacity and capability required to make that move. Of course, key investment in research and development, incentivizing those who are making the best moves and early moves, and recognizing on-farm mitigation, such as any kind of vegetation on plant that might actually help offset some of the agricultural emissions. So we are, of course, committed to continue our investment in climate change research, and the Minister just outlined how important this really is. We are really good at this, and we are leading the world on some of the components that will help lower agricultural emissions. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in this, and the important thing is to give farmers and growers future options to respond to those challenges, so that they come from a well-researched evidence base as we are building our policy framework to achieve our objectives. The Sustainable Land Use Budget Packet was a key government initiative last year, the government's wellbeing package. It provided $229 million to deliver government goals for the land-based sector, and it was really formative in the way it looked at integrated outcomes around freshwater biodiversity and climate change, including Māori agribusiness. It supports farmers to transition more smoothly into more productive and sustainable land uses. It supports them to help meet environmental bottom lines and achieve any kind of land use changes that might be necessary to optimize their farm system. It includes practical advice, information and tools, support for Māori landowners and agribusinesses to realize greater profitability and sustainability of their land, building industry advisor capabilities and pathways, improving on-farm emissions, upgrading relevant decisions tools. So overseers was just mentioned before. It's a critical one to make sure it's fit for purpose, and enhancing pathways to market for high-value products. Going forward, this year's budget obviously had a strong focus on how we best support the economic recovery following the COVID crisis, but we didn't lose sight of supporting sustainability for agriculture. This is a key part, and the recent announcement for Action for Healthy Waterways really demonstrates the government's commitment to keep working towards lifting environmental bottom lines and supporting the sector to make this transition. Other key investments as part of the budget included the apprenticeships and industry training with an agricultural focus, investment in biosecurity, and support for regional environmental projects. I think all in all, this shows how committed MPI is to work with the sector to deliver ambitious environmental outcomes that really underpin the success of our primary industries. And so with that, I thank you. And I see the Minister is still here. I was going to finish with a quote from him that just to me really outlines how deeply we understand the importance of our environment and how it underpins our primary industry. So thank you. I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I really appreciate that. So we're going to change format now, and we're going to move on to the next speaker, and then I'm going to hold a panel with Jenny and our next speaker in that afterwards. So our next speaker, another colleague of mine, is Julie Collins. So Julie is our Deputy Director General of Te Ururakau. She has a Bachelor of Forestry Science and more than 30 years of experience in forestry and land use policy. Very, very pragmatic and a great connoisseur of white wine, I believe, as well, Julie. She previously worked for the New Zealand forestry sector and its successor. And this work involved evaluation of Crown Forests conservation policy for Indigenous forests on private land and incorporating forestry and agriculture into the ETS. Julie also spent 15 years in the UK, so brings a wealth of international experience to the role as well. She worked with the forestry industry to identify and solve their business issues and led work on renewable energy, grant development and sustainability initiatives. So my great pleasure to invite Julie. And Julie?
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, John. I also worked on dairy reform under the Common Agricultural Policy and also the Rural Development Regulation. So a little bit beyond forestry. I'm just going to share my screen now. See if I can go. Where is it saying share?
Should be just down the bottom. Perfect.
Yep. Have you got it?
Yep, it's looking good.
Okay, look, you asked, the interesting thing for me last time, I think I spoke to this group. I was in Jenny's role. I was head of climate change policy for MPI, and I was focusing on agriculture and the ETS. So the world has changed somewhat since that time, being as I'm looking after the forestry side this time. So I was going to give you a quick overview. Just trying to get my can't get the screen to move on. John, who's controlling the screen?
You should be. Maybe Kate, are you able to move the screen on?
You are screen sharing? My computer is not moving it. Can Kate move it? Page. Hang on, page down. Nope. Screen seems to be a bit frozen.
Maybe if you take a screen back again, Julie, and then share it again. That's.
Okay.
I knew it couldn't go perfectly. If I was sharing it, something had to go wrong.
Okay, let me go. Screen share. Right.
No, it's right there. Can I move on?
No, it's not moving.
Are you sure you got more than one slide?
Yep, I do. Oh, here we go. I've just
Perfect.
swiped it. There you go. So look, just for participants, I'm going to give a quick overview of how much forest we've got in New Zealand and its role in terms of meeting our greenhouse gas emissions targets. A little bit of a quick reminder around how forestry has been incorporated into the emissions trading scheme, the changes that we are making, and then obviously following on from the previous speakers, just reinforcing the importance of the integration of trees on farms and both the climate change but the broader water and biodiversity benefits that they can make. So just a little bit of a reminder for everyone. Around just under 40% of our land area is in some form of forestry. The vast bulk of it is actually in our Indigenous forest estate, with 9.9 million hectares. And a really important point, of that 9.9 million hectares in Indigenous forestry, 1.6 is actually on private land, and a lot of that on our Māori land or on our sheep and beef farmland, where farmers have had an active role in actually conserving forests. About 2.1 million is actually in commercial forests, but you'll often hear the figure of 1.7 million hectares of a commercial forest. That's the net productive area of that commercial forest estate. And about 600,000 hectares of our forest estate was established after 1990. From 1990 onwards, and that's the area that we talk about as being post 89 forest land, which is eligible for earning carbon units in the emissions trading scheme, and approximately half of that is currently registered in the emissions trading scheme. So our greenhouse gases, New Zealand has committed to reducing our greenhouse gases to 30% below our 2005 levels by 2030. So in 2005, we produced 83 million tonnes of CO2. So essentially what that means is that annually over the next period of time, up to 2030, we need to reduce our emissions by some 25 million tonnes per annum. And there's only three ways of doing that. One is we actually adopt mitigation techniques and we reduce our net emissions. Two, we offset them by undertaking other activities such as forestry. Or three, we buy emissions units from other countries. And at the moment, New Zealand's emissions trading scheme's a closed system. So really our only options is either offset or reduction. So forestry has a significant role to play, both the commercial forestry estate, but also the way we integrate trees onto our farming systems as well. And I think Jenny mentioned that He Waka Eke Noa, in terms of the work they're doing around bringing agriculture in the ETS, is actually looking at how small areas of trees on farms could be used to offset on-farm emissions. So forestry, probably the only other thing to say is in terms of that mix in terms of how do we meet our emissions targets. The Climate Change Commission, which was established by the previous climate change legislation, has been set up to provide government advice on the 5-year emission reduction budgets. And those budgets will set out where emissions should come from within the economy and the role that forestry should play to offset those emissions. So they will provide detailed 5-yearly emission advice to government on those 5-year emission budgets, which will set out the formula for how we make those emission savings going forward. So Forestry in the ETS there's two categories, and the New Zealand emissions trading scheme follows international rules where it treats forestry that was planted before 1990 or established before 1990. So this is the bulk of our Indigenous forest estate and about 2/3 of our commercial plantation estate as a carbon store, like like coal that's still in the ground or oil reserves. And basically the rules say that you can't earn carbon units from those units, but you can, but you will face the deforestation emissions if you choose to change that forest from forestry to some other land use and chop those trees down. However, for forests that were planted after 1989, they're basically treating these as new forests that can earn carbon units called New Zealand emissions units in our emissions trading scheme. And so to give you an example, a radiata pine forest over its lifetime, so of around 26 to 30 years, will sequester between 500 and 900 tonnes of carbon, depending on where it's planted. So 900 tonnes in regions like the East Cape, where you've got, where the region's wetter and you've got very fertile soils, 500, 550 tonnes in areas like down in the east coast of the South Island, where it's drier and colder. Under the current approach, carbon accounting approach, you earn carbon units as those trees grow, and then you have to pay those units to government when those forests are harvested, and then as the next rotation grows, you earn units back again, and that's called the stock accounting system. The government's put through some recent changes, was putting through some recent changes to the emissions trading scheme to make it simpler and easier, and I'll talk through those in a minute. When we originally set up the scheme, we really envisioned that the emissions trading scheme for forestry would be more appealing to large-scale commercial forest owners that had large plantings. But actually, of the 2,050 participants, 1,700 of those participants are actually farm foresters who have planted forests on those farms and entered them into the emissions trading scheme. And there's some 325,000 hectares of forestry in the ETS, and we've issued around $1.4 billion worth of carbon units over the last 10 years to forest owners for those units. So the changes to the emissions trading scheme have been made to make it easier, and there's a range of changes. And they essentially include, I'm just going through and looking at my notes, so they include changing the carbon accounting system. So by the 1st of January 2023, a new carbon accounting system will be introduced, which is called average accounting. So what this means is that rather than earn carbon units as your trees go, pay them back when you harvest, and then earn them back again as the second rotation grows, what it does is it puts a simplified scheme in place that when you plant a new forest, you earn up to the long-term average of carbon sequestrated in that forest, and then you don't have to repay those units when they're harvested. So for farmers who only have one stand of forests of a single age class, it makes it much simpler. So you'll earn the average amount of carbon that'll be stored in that forest over its lifetime when you first plant, and then as long as you replant it after it's harvested, you don't have to repay those emissions. The other things that are being put through to make the scheme simpler and easier is it's allowing forests, both pre-1990 forests and post-89 forests, people who've entered the scheme don't have to pay back emissions units when there's been a fire or a flood or a natural event that means that forest has been damaged and there's been a loss of carbon. As long as they replant that forest and keep it in forestry, they just sit on an emissions holiday. it introduces a new category of forest called a permanent forest sink, and those units coming from that forest will be tagged. So to have a permanent forestry, you have to maintain it in forestry for a 50-year period of time. So this is the current net stock carbon accounting, which is the graph that goes up and then goes down when you harvest, and the dotted line shows the new average carbon accounting system. So that the bill that puts those new rules in place had its second reading last week, and is set to go through third reading in the next period of time. So very quickly, there's been a lot of concern around the impact of the emissions trading scheme on forestry, and that we're seeing a large increase in forestry. So over the last 15 years, essentially, we've seen a reduction of the forest estate by 7%, or 130 hectares, and it was only in 2018 was the first time we saw that net afforestation was greater than net deforestation. Last year, 2019 planting season, we saw 22,000 hectares of new forest established. We're yet to get the deforestation figures through, and we've got 14,000 hectares of new forest sitting in the pipeline for registration in the ETS. The new rules put through for carbon accounting that are going through the House, we estimate will increase the net afforested area in New Zealand up to 2050 by somewhere between 600,000 and 1.1 million hectares. So we've talked about this, so I won't dwell on that. Really, trees can play a really beneficial role when integrated appropriately on farms and fitted in with existing farming systems, from erosion control, animal welfare issues, shade and shelter, improving biodiversity and protecting the waterways. The government's got a range of existing initiatives that have been put in place to support farmers. One of them has been the 1 Billion Trees program, and there's two elements of funding underneath that. One's the 1 Billion Trees Fund, which supports farmers to actually plant trees on farm, but also supports community and other projects like training, nursery development, and on-farm advice to support people to plant trees. And then the other is a very long-standing program that we've had going since the mid-2000s with regional councils, which is a partnership with regional councils to go out and work with farmers, provide farm environment plans, map erosion probe in areas, and to support farmers to undertake land treatment such as pole planting, fencing riparian areas, and retiring land that's extremely erosion prone. So that's a very quick run through for me. So I'll finish there and open for questions.
Thanks very much, Julie. That was fantastic and bang on time. Fantastic. So I suppose the team that organized the webinar provided me with some great notes, and they probably didn't realize that with my Celtic heritage and my Y chromosome, I'm unable to follow instructions. So some of you will have seen a point come up in the webinar chat there that we have a record of all the questions, and we will endeavor to post answers to all the questions online along with a recording of the webinar. So I was meant to say that at the start, so I'm just updating you guys now. So look, that was two great presentations to follow on from the Minister, and a number of questions have flowed in. Now, you may have answered this one already, Julie and Jenny, but I'll ask it anyway in case it isn't. Can you explain the background as to why we are not talking about offsetting emissions with the planting of trees on our own farms?
I can talk a little bit about that, and Julie might want to add something too. This is absolutely something that is being considered as part of the He Waka Eke Noa policy work. There is some early advice and analysis going on, so I can't tell you any more in detail other than this has certainly not been dismissed, and it's still being actively worked through as to what that means in terms of our climate change commitments internationally, how we do things domestically, and how all of that works together.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jenny. Julie, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, that's quite right. It is been incorporated into He Waka Ikanoa. Going back to my background around the original design of the emissions trading scheme, there was always a trade-off between the amount of effort and cost of putting an application in for the ETS and the value of the carbon being sequestered. And the other issue with anything that you enter into the ETS from a tree point of view, it's great when the tree's growing, but you then have to pay back those units when those trees are removed. So a call was made that anything below 5 hectares wouldn't be counted into the emissions trading scheme, just because the administrative costs were greater than the actual value received from the carbon benefits. But I think the great advantage of looking at agriculture and the ETS, and when you take a whole farm approach, you're able to net off all those small areas against your agricultural emissions and come up with a net value for the farm, and that's where being able to account those small area of trees really pays off.
Fantastic.
And I think just in relation to another question I spied along there that's associated with it, of course there is many co-benefits to vegetation that hasn't escaped us in terms of animal welfare, in terms of managing heat stress, retaining soil, preventing erosion, and with that preventing sediment, polluting water with phosphorus, etc. And so we are aware of the benefits, and that's why we are working so intensely with the sector on this integrated farm planning approach, so that land users can really optimize those kind of elements in their landscape.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jenny. It's quite a detailed question here, and it may be one that we have to provide an answer to afterwards, but I'll ask it to you anyway. And the Minister's presentation of the seaweed solution is interesting as it directs our attention offshore. We tend to assume that New Zealand finished at the seashore, but New Zealand includes our exclusive economic zone, which is out to 200 nautical miles off the coast. Why do we not include this in our carbon calculations? Research on ecosystem services shows that the EEZ carbon dioxide sink is equivalent to 5% of carbon dioxide uptake by the world's oceans. This is an order of magnitude greater than that of New Zealand's forests. This research says that the annual net ocean carbon sink of 0.05 gigatons of this area is similar to New Zealand's total annual anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions. Not sure if either of you have an answer for that, or whether we will need to provide
I think there's been a lot of exciting science done in that space in the last 10 years since the emissions trading scheme was originally established. I think that's probably one we probably want to come back to with an answer from MFE and the team.
No problem.
I think it's a really great question and a tricky one. So I would love to be able to come back to you with something that,
okay. We will park that one. I can assure whoever sent in that question that we are doing an awful lot of work on open ocean aquaculture and seaweed and kelp as potential sequestration vehicles for carbon dioxide as well. So Jenny, this one's directed at you, and it's picking up on the Minister's comments that a constantly recurring issue at last year's Ag Climate Conference was the need to boost the education and transfer of information at several levels. So science to farmers effectively. Enforcers to farmers and research to policy, etc. So all of those different vehicles. In the post-lockdown environment and desperately needing a green recovery, are we now paying a price for not getting ahead of the play on this important platform? And is there something we should be doing more about?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we're working on and talking about. Part of it is you might have noticed in the presentation that the investment in the on-farm advice and also building the capability of farm advisors. A lot of these extension programs are exactly designed to boost our focus and investment in translating science and evidence into advice for farmers that makes sense at farm scale. We are aware, I think there is a bit of a lag of seeing the initiative translate into action that can be seen, and COVID certainly hasn't helped, but it is on our minds, and I think there is a big focus in the investment on advice as well as capability building.
That's great, thank you. Kind of a philosophical question here I'll put to you, Julie, just can't have you having it too easy. in the approach of supplying the most discerning people, is that the right focus is the question. They may have more money, but they are significantly higher personal emissions output than other citizens in New Zealand and the world, might be better aligned to our low emissions food story.
What was the beginning of the question, John?
So the Minister had mentioned an approach to supplying food to the most discerning people in the world who will be willing to pay for a lower carbon product. What this person's asking is that we already have a low carbon product, and those discerning consumers tend to have really high personal footprints. Would we be not better off aiming at the rest of the world with our low carbon footprint story?
Yeah, but I think we also, we're a small country at the bottom of the world with high costs to get our goods to market. And I think if we want to be able to get recognition for the carbon value and all the environmental works and animal welfare, good animal welfare reputation that sits behind our farming systems, we actually need to punch into those higher value markets that serve the mid to high income customers.
Very
Basically,
good.
the poor of the world won't want to pay for our goods. They also eat less meat.
Good. So I'm going to combine two questions here. The questions keep moving and putting me off. But there's two questions. Are points awarded for planting of indigenous forests that will not be cut down? And will we see some ETS credit for native planting in riparian areas?
So the permanent forest sink, new permanent forest category is designed to actually do that. So those indigenous forests planted and entered into that category will just keep on earning units over time as they grow. So they, unlike a harvested forest, they'll just carry on. They won't be in the averaging scheme. You can earn money from indigenous forests. That was established after 1990 now, provided it's over the threshold. Stuff that's under the threshold, again, will be looked at being included as part of the He Waka Eka Noa process.
Excellent. All right, and finally, we're just about to run out of time, but again, I'm going to combine two questions that come from two diametrically opposite viewpoints. One is that planting trees on farm can be a good for animal welfare, shade and shelter, seems like a win-win. Is this being discussed with farmers? And the other one is, how do you respond to concerns that this will encourage the planting of trees on productive agricultural land that would otherwise be used for food production? Julie, that's probably one that you've got a lot of experience answering.
I thoroughly, having done the animal welfare portfolio before the forestry portfolio, I thoroughly support, really well integrated trees on farms where they're married with maximising the productive capacity of the farm. And through the Hill Country Erosion Scheme and the work regional councils have done with farmers, that's really aimed at looking at how can you integrate trees to stabilise soil erosion, improve water quality without taking the most important land out of production. And that's why a lot of the Hill Country Erosion Scheme, the 1 billion tree program, the new funding for catchment-based approaches is focused on working with farmers in terms of how to maximise both productive and environmental capacity on farms. The emissions trading scheme, however, is a price incentive, and it is also incentivising a group of investors, both New Zealand and overseas investors, to buy land to plant trees on. And there's been quite a bit of controversy about it. The work that we've done has shown that they are buying that land in some key hotspots where you've got higher amounts of class 6, 7 and 8 land, and 90% of the land that is entered into the ETS and is registered to enter into the ES is all on class 6, 7 and 8.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julie. Look, I'm not going to. There's a bunch of other questions, but I'll start picking and choosing, and we're already out of time. But just again to assure the audience that we're going to work our way through these questions, and either ourselves at MPI or at NZAGRC will get an answer to these up online. So nothing left for me to do other than to thank you for coming to the first webinar in the Towards a Low Emissions Future series. I think scene was set really well by the Minister, who has a deep passion for the primary sector and a low carbon primary sector into the future. And I think, you know, the number 8 wire ingenuity of New Zealand farmers working closely with the science community has served us well for the last century, and I think it will serve us well into the next century. So please make sure that you register for the next webinar in the series, which is taking place next Tuesday morning. But the attendance link will be different, so you need to register via the website to be able to join that one. Once you leave this session, there'll be a short survey. It'll only take you a few minutes, but we'd really love your feedback. Obviously, as all of you know, we're living in a different world, and I think, you know, some of what we've experienced over the last 7 to 8 weeks will probably stand to us. So it'll be really good to know how you found this webinar and how we could improve on it in the future. And please be generous to the chairmanship. So without further ado, we will leave it there. Thank you very much.